All right, guys, the BLG T1 game just concluded, and holy shit, this was an absolute banger. So I'm gonna get right into it, cover some of the most important pieces to think about from a draft perspective. Although gameplay was very important, I think draft was arguably the creative part of this series for both sides. Both the way in BLG kind of coerced T1 into play drafting in a certain way. The importance of things like blue side, it was very important in this game in order, not necessarily in just priority picks, but also being able to establish the shape of the draft, and then taking like really conceited trades or really specific trades and being really intentional about them, and then having solutions otherwise where you have holes in your draft. And I wanted to cover that. Firstly, starting off, BLG, they banned Azir and Orianna every single game. They took the Team Liquid route, essentially. I did quote before that this was a very expensive solution in order to kind of counter T1, and BLG apparently thinks the same way. And this is most likely because they value the importance of negating the Azir Orianna trade matchup and that sort of front to back dynamic so much that they'd rather play into the style of T1 that is not against that, more of the battle mages and whatnot. And this is very much an intentional choice by BLG because if they think that T1 stylistically is not very strong playing this style, and if Faker is not on a very strong and stable and playing like normal conditions and playing the normal League of Legends, let's call it, then BLG have the upper hand. So that's why they ban out both. Then they first pick Talia. Then they're willing to deal with whatever else. In this case, their third ban is a little more malleable. Sometimes they will throw away Ashe. Sometimes they'll go for other things, and it makes sense. Ashe still gives a lot of problems to pretty much every single sort of AD carry, and T1 can flex it across both roles, and it gives it a very large problem. So I think in this first draft, it's nothing too crazy until Tristana comes out on R5. So everything else is pretty standard. BLG is pretty willing to give Senna over, and they're willing to just play out the matchup pretty much in exchange for getting the Talia B1 and then having resources to play for it. So what happens in exchange is that they actually play Tristana into the Talia. So all tournaments, T1 have basically opted to just ban it out, and they have not been playing it at all for any of their series. So BLG probably assumed something similar, and they were just not willing to play against it or play with it. So they leave it open. They actually give it to Faker on R5. So that is something that probably threw them for a loop, and that's totally fine because it's a calibrating game, right? Usually you can only, the surprise factor only happens once. Faker gets away with it. It probably still did fared fine for BLG in their eyes, but definitely something that they have to account for in the future games. And this is probably a big factor as to why T1 were able to come out ahead in the first game. Moving on to game 2, they learned their lesson a little bit, or T1 learned their lesson, and they end up kind of like, well, there goes that Tristana card, because they're never gonna let that shit through again. So same bans coming through. BLG are on red side this time because they won the first game, so they end up banning Azir Ori, and they don't want to play the Senna matchup this time. So in exchange, this obviously means they're going to give up Ashe B1, and they're willing to take Kalista Varus, which half is about taking priority picks, and also half about picking a good matchup, as good of a matchup into the Ashe as possible. The Draven is the response, so it makes it for a quad AD carry bottom lane, which is very interesting and very volatile. So obviously this draft is going to become all about bottom lane, all about being able to support the bottom lane and do what you can. And this, the importance of banning out the cringe, sort of isolating nightmares top laners becomes more and more into fruition. So you see all the bad Kasante counters are pretty much gone, I would say, unless, barring some really unique and random picks. So that's why BLG feel pretty safe taking it on 4 here, and they want to do, and they somehow prioritize Sejuani on 3. However, T1 are willing to play the Camille matchup, so they reveal more and more information. And this is the start of the antics of where I mentioned T1 compensate for their potential holes in draft by just picking a random champion and seeing what happens. And it's a little uncharacteristic of Faker, to be honest with you, because he's usually not that kind of player to bust out the crazy stuff. But in this case, he's going all for the off meta. And while I like the Tristana pick in game 1, the Akali pick on paper is probably not the strongest thing in the world because of both the matchup into the Nico. It's not necessarily that strong, and in a world where you're playing quality carry and the bottom lane is so important, and you're playing like a really weak laner, let's say, like more like a diluting laner, and your team fights are a little bit hard because there's so much peel and whatnot on the side of BLG. However, if anyone's going to be able to pilot and navigate around that, it's probably going to be Faker. And I think a comp like the one that they have here with Sejuani, Camille, and the Akali to be able to have a lot of backline access against like a double AD carry comp, then it's very very doable. It's like very scaling based on the composition and execution. T1 actually end up having that work out, and the antics continue here. So they go Senna, they pre-pick Nidalee. This has been the pick to kind of go along with or without the Senna. It usually brings out a lot of more room for jungle sort of manipulation in lanes, and T1 are usually willing to trade the Nautilus into that. So BLG do not want to deal with the Senna at all. It's up to T1 whether they want to come up with a bigger solution or a more interesting solution. I could see if this was G2, you would bust out Kog'Maw here, but most teams are just willing to trade Kalista and use the priority to transition that lead elsewhere. So you can kind of see it's a little bit premeditated here with the first 3 picks. TF is semi-flex, but they're most likely trying to lean it towards top lane. So there is that opportunity for manipulation, right? I think a big test for many teams is their ability to come up with a creative answer or how they execute upon that. Most teams go for the Yasuo, as does Zeus as well. Nothing too surprising there. What is surprising is both the Annie B5 from BLG and the Zac counter. So to completely be honest with you, this is most likely because the mid lane pool is so choked at this point. I'm not sure if it was necessarily a pick. Like, I was trying to think if it was a pick to hedge against certain mid lane picks, but there were literally like 5 to 6 mid laners banned. Like, it's like the entire pool. So at this point, I honestly don't blame them why they would pick Annie at this point, because there's just really not much left. You could go like Syndra at this point. Like, what would the team call for, right? So at this point, it honestly makes sense if you're playing for a comp like this, but it does leave you for that potential counter, and that is Faker taking a page out of Insanity's book with the Zac mid. And this ironically is actually probably a practiced pick because of the Yasuo into TF specific counter with mid lane R5. So that is the other part about T1 having these really specific mid lane drafts and red side drafts, with mid lane being picked last, which is really uncharacteristic of them as well. They usually just pick a Azir Ori on first rotation as soon as possible, push everyone back to get resources, because they have a lot of other players that are excellent at getting counterpicked, like Keria and Zeus. Game 4. Kind of a similar vibe here, and I think we're starting to feel the pressure from both sides, right? Because BLG is at match point, and T1 end up going for another Senna route. And basically, at this point, they stop really taking risks. And I think this is where, although they can play like really well with like normal comps, I don't necessarily think this is where they shine. They usually need like an edge pick to sort of come out on top here. And I think while it's not the greatest that they end up drafting like this, or they end up being scared, you could feel their fear a little bit. They can still get away with it because they're so comfortable on the Senna. Last pick, same thing, right? They're not garnering any advantage here. They do win game 4, but the momentum is awkward because then they end up losing side selection for game 5, which clearly is very important for this series because it really dictates whether or not you can go for the opener. So Senna is B1. BLG prioritizes it more than the Talia now because they don't think it's important anymore. So they give that up, and then T1 take the Nautilus instead. And again, not really much risk being taken here. They trade Nautilus again, and they go for Varus. And understandably, they don't go for the Kalista trade because they probably think it didn't really work out very well. It wasn't very strong, so they opted for a different route. But I think you could have seen this coming. And if you have like a sort of premeditated draft like this, perhaps there could be another opportunity to come up with other ways. That's why I really like the Kog'Maw route from G2, or they can go Jinx and they just play for like giga outscaling. It's hard to outscale Senna Ornn though, so do it what you will. But I don't really see much in the way of like creativity in terms of thinking about what to pick, right? Like, especially on this R5 here, I think this is a missed opportunity to go Cassante here because of the fact that they see the Camille, they can counter the Camille, and they just didn't want to take the risk and accepted a self-counter pick instead. And this is what I mean. It was super good. It was super good when they were really trying to deploy really unique solutions, and I think Zeus really has it in him to be able to body this guy. But this is why I wanted to emphasize the draft in this game, because I think it was so important. These players are all like at the top of their game, really, really high caliber. Like, it's not really going to be that big of a differential, right? We're talking millimeters of difference, and where all the difference comes, and where what can differentiate and win a loss in this case is your champion, because that is really, it's crazy to say, it's really more the limiting factor than your ability at this point, and that's crazy to say from a game like League, right? And that's why I wanted to point out that there's all the little antics that went on, banning not just to get rid of things, but to create a certain draft environment so that BLG could play better, and so that T1 were more limited and had to deploy more creative options. And then once it went to Game 5, BLG had basically seen that T1 had exhausted everything in their book, apparently, and then they could basically just take it from there and drive it home. So in my eyes, I think they did deserve it. They really smart in the way they deployed their draft, and they understood why they opted for these bans and their specific approach, and why stylistically they can match well against them. And I think they really earned a spot in the grand final. So hope that's all there is to it for this match. Hope that was really insightful to you guys, and I'll catch you in the next one.